Uh, One quick caveat before I get started. This was based on a sabbatical project. This is something I presented to my fellow librarians and staff at SUNY Cortland, and they had some good comments for me. I've tried to build them in. One thing that I did not do was, due to other constraints, is I didn't go back and do a lot of reworking of this after the COVID-19 crisis really came upon us. So there are probably some really great examples, and especially stressing the importance of deception, which I have not put in here. That does not mean that that is necessarily something that there are clearly some very clear resonances here. It's become very clear that this sort of thing has become even more important now than it did before. But I haven't worked it in. So, but I think we can, as information professionals, you can all probably, see what the implications are, and, work that through for yourselves in your particular context and for your particular audience. All right, having said that, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so I was on sabbatical last year from July to December, and I said, my goal was to explore what is known about detecting deception to see if we might improve teaching our students about deception in library instruction. And the important thing for me was the scope, because obviously incorrect information is a multifaceted problem, and teaching people how to detect it and deal with it is quite complicated. So I wanted to really focus in on deception itself, not just inaccuracy or fake news and whatever that label means and how different people use it. That was, I figured that would kind of just cause the whole thing to spiral out of control. As it happens, of course, these things do make their way back in, and that's just sort of the nature of the project. But that I was trying to kind of keep it confined to this particular aspect, and we'll get into what that, what deception in particular is as we go along. So I just want to make it clear I wanted to give myself something that was actually manageable. Now, I looked at some of the library science literature, and my main takeaway, and this maybe I wasn't looking at the right sources, but there are, it's possible that you have seen some references that might be helpful here, and if you do, please let me know. But my main takeaway was teaching people about deception is really important, which we know, but I felt that I wanted to see what other fields had actually been working on with regard to this. Okay, so how do we detect deception? Can we bring that back to our classrooms and do something with that? And to do so meant going a bit beyond the usual scope of library literature. So I dipped a little bit in. Now, I'm not going to say I'm an expert in any one of these, definitely. It was just kind of a quick excursion into the literature in these 4 fields: psychology, computer science, business and marketing, and military intelligence, just to see if I could pull something out that I could then take back to a classroom and kind of present it to people as something, what can we get out of these fields where people are so intent on figuring out who's deceiving people or trying to perpetrate deceptions, and be able to take some nuggets of wisdom back to us in the library. So let's go ahead with that. Once again, as I went forward, I started to have to also whittle down the concept of deception a bit. So self-deception is just too complicated to deal with here. Little lies like "you look great today," not really relevant to library instruction, let's face it. Deceptions with humorous intent were also excluded, because the question that always arises with those is how many people need to get it for it to be humorous deception, and at what point, if you it's kind of putting together a deceptive situation with a different sort of focus, because it has like the revelation and the deception together in one package, and that people should be able to get those both. And then sometimes people do and sometimes people don't. And I just started thinking about that. It's like, this is way too complicated. So I pushed that aside as well. So starting to think about deception and how exactly to define it, I'm still not too sure how to define deception, but I think we can talk about some pretty key traits of it. One of which is that it requires interaction or an audience. You can't deceive somebody aside from yourself alone in a room. There has to be communication. There have to be multiple parties involved. Often it is not a singular act, but a combination of different acts, individual acts that come and lead to a single deception. For example, let's say you're trying to throw a friend a surprise party. So you've got to not let that person know that the party is there. You've got to bring in other people to help you set up the party. You've got to let them know not to talk about the party. Maybe you have to make some sort of special arrangement to get a cake or some balloons in there. And maybe that involves letting, kind of suggesting that the person you're throwing the party for needs to be somewhere else. All this sort of thing. Turning off the lights and then turning them on when the person walks in the room. So there's like this basically one deception, but there's a whole bunch that goes into that one deception. And so when we look at deception, we want to do more than just look at the individual parts. We want to recognize that there's a broader scheme, and there's also these individual acts that do this. One key aspect of this is that it should lead to a change in behavior that would not occur if the person was aware of those acts. So if that person would have behaved in the same way whether or not you were throwing a surprise party, then it doesn't really matter whether you threw them a surprise party or not. So that's another part of it. There's a change in behavior associated with it. So there are some complicating factors here regarding intended transmission, because intent is important. Passing on incorrect information is not deception. That just means that person is mistaken and is passing on, giving material that's not correct. And that, of course, is one it's quite crucial and a distinction we really want to make, because it is possible to pass on in good faith information that is not correct, but you're not actually trying to fool anybody. Where this becomes complicated is with the idea of automated creation. So if I create some sort of bot that basically just puts up websites with certain keywords on them and just kind of jumbles together words, and maybe some of that's deceptive, is that automated deception? Who had the intent to deceive? Is it the programmer? Is it the bot? Probably not. And I don't have a really great answer for that. This is something that I think we're going to have to continue to think about as it unfolds, as these programs get more and more sophisticated. It's also important to note the chain of transmission, that deception can enter in at any stage. Of course, our favorite examples are, those clickbait headlines that somebody puts on an article, or somebody writes an article that just takes information from another article and then kind of maybe puts their own spin on it, which may be misleading, and then puts that out. So the original article may not be deceptive, but the presentation of that later through another source may be. So the question that it all comes down to, setting aside all this theory and these implications and the complexities of it, can we detect deception? And I could say, having looked at this problem, maybe. And now we're going to get into why I say maybe. First of all, let's do with the most popular one, the one in which most literature has been written. Can we detect deception in person? According to popular media and some older studies, certain people, spies, cops, profilers, are better at detecting deception than others. But when we get down to it, most detection of deception is little better than chance in most situations. There are no groups that can detect lies better than others. When people are able to do that, it usually works better with outside information and context. That's one. When the person has some information that the person who is trying to deceive them isn't trying to portray. And also when if there's a confession that person has been trying to deceive someone. Now, apparently that is not necessarily a 100% effective in some cases, but it does certainly help. Of course, this is less of a help to us as librarians, because a lot of the times the people who are trying, when we try to teach people about, looking at their material and figuring out if whether it's deceptive, it's usually students who don't have a whole lot of context. They don't have a whole lot of inside information or outside information. They basically are just, we can help them out, I'd say, by helping them build up their knowledge based on reading articles, in a number of articles, and then applying that to the whole. But they're not going to be subject field experts by any means. And also trying to get someone to confess is, of course, a little bit difficult when you're dealing with digital materials, and when we're sometimes not even clear who the author of a piece is, let alone what their motivations are, let alone how we can track them down and see if we can get them to tell us that what they did was deceptive. So there's not a whole lot we can take from this. So let's move forward to deception in text, the challenges of research. So when we're trying to look at how people, if there are markers of deception that people put in text as they're writing it for an audience, it becomes very challenging, because first of all, the one thing we know is that markers of deception may vary considerably between different types of text. So even like very small genres, like online dating profiles might have one set of criteria, and maybe online reviews would have something else. And we're going to get into that a little bit more a bit later. Also, there's sort of a catch-22 to this research design, which is that, okay, so if you're going to show people examples of deception, you could either create something for it, or you can get something, say, out of the wild, a real-life example of deception. But the difficulty is that if you create something for your experiment, that's sort of an artificial creation of an attempt to deceive. And the question is, okay, is that going to be like something that you might find out on the internet? And if you find something out on the internet and you want to bring it into your study, so you're already putting a judgment on that about whether it's deception. So it becomes difficult to tell what is and what isn't. And then you start getting into some difficulties there. I think that one example I do recall where someone was able to use something that was at least a little bit more less questionable was I think there was some research using some emails from Enron during that whole scandal, and then so people could compare what was being said in the emails to the to what actually was happening behind the scenes at the company, and people could kind of judge, okay, maybe this is deceptive. But this is, these are very sort of limited circumstances where you can do it, and it doesn't apply to every genre that's out there that we might run into. So this is an area where this can be a little bit deceptive or misleading. So one item I found out was about positive language. There are some indicators that overly positive language in a work indicates deception. If you see a lot of glowing praise, then there might be some sort of attempt to not be forthcoming about what the person actually feels. I am actually, at this point, we've moved on to text, so we're moved on to writing. I just want to answer that quick question from the chat. So you look at something like online reviews. These are likely to have very positive or negative content just because of the nature of online reviews. Who's going to write an online review generally? It's not going to be that person who is kind of okay with something, right? It's going to be somebody who had a really good experience or a really bad experience. And so we can't necessarily assume that that positive language trait applies to every sort of text we run into. Online dating profiles are another example. So I think we all accept that there's probably going to be some lying in online dating profiles. I think this is something that we accept as part of our culture, as part of our media, that as people put things in dating profiles that aren't actually true. And yet when we look at the research about that, there were actually constraints on how much people were willing to lie in online dating profiles, because people desired to have a face-to-face meeting. So if they were just going to put something up there and then it was going to lead to an in-person rejection later on due to inaccuracy, that was often a constraint on them. Of course, I think there are some people who see online dating as just an opportunity to, interact with other people online, in which case the findings here don't necessarily apply to everyone who's using online dating profiles. So you can start to see that this starts to get more and more complex, both based on the genre and within the genre itself. So let's go on ahead. But okay, we're not teaching people about online reviews necessarily or online dating profiles. We are teaching people about, journals, websites, scholarly articles, or even popular articles. Once again, there are great variations in traits across genres. And unfortunately for us, most research attention has been paid on the shorter pieces, because it's easier to sort of do some experimental design on it. It takes less time for your those experimented on, I'm missing the word right now, to basically look at them and make a judgment on them. We don't have so much on websites or other sources because these are longer texts. They take longer to process. And also there are some copyright concerns here about people, adopting things into their research design and then having to ask people for copyright permission, possibly, in order to continue to use them. So that's that makes it a little bit more difficult to carry out the sort of research that would be really relevant to us. We should definitely keep an eye on this, but I think this is going to be something that's going to be a while in coming. I will say the indicators so far are not encouraging. For example, there was one experiment done regarding the content of online medical forums, mainly to see if people could detect expertise, because these forums had both medical professionals and laymen commenting on people's questions. And they found, what was encouraging was that hey, it seems like people are actually able to tell when they're getting information from a doctor. But the sole indicator that seemed to be relevant was the length of the words that the person posting used. And of course, if somebody wanted to be deceiving others, it would be very easy to maybe just, increase the length of the words used and then give this impression that they had expertise that they did not. We also had, going back to some of our research on dating profiles, people often were basing their evaluation of the accuracy of one of these profiles on its length. Not anything else about it, just the length. That seemed to be the only factor that was really, causing people to make a judgment one way or the other. And that is something which I think should be deeply concerning to us, that even, people who are going on to into these situations may be making their judgments based on very sort of superficial criteria. So, is automation the solution? Can we rely on some sort of bot to go out there and tag the internet to see if we can say, hey, this is accurate and this is not? Maybe that level of computational ability can eventually give us answers to those questions in a very simple way. Well, this research is very much in its infancy. There's little examination of linguistic and cultural differences amongst the various texts that are examined. Most of the research is focuses on English language texts, for example. The detection of the rhetorical structures that might have something that could reveal deception that we might be able to use as markers are still being developed. I don't know if I have this here or later, but part of the problem is also that the people who are trying to deceive others, like the top end deceivers, like the people who are really, state actors and people like that who are really concerned about how well they can deceive people, go in and they read this literature and they keep up on it, and so that any sort of model that's created can then be counter modeled, and so we sort of get this escalation. And then of course the question of, even if we did that, if we had something that was successful and worked, would it really do anything? For a while there, Facebook was putting some notices on particular posts. Once again, this is pre-COVID-19, about their accuracy. And the general result was that when they look back and see what people did, they pretty much did what they were going to do anyway. They just kind of ignored the message from Facebook. And and so the question is, even if we, if we have some sort of effective system, what is our guarantee that people will use it? And once again, the deception, as I said, deception techniques change over time. It's part of a natural progression that is just part of the cycle of deception. And yeah, we can count on people who want to deceive others, reading about those techniques and adapting their techniques to compensate. And as part of it, this sort of ongoing escalation of trying to deceit and trying to uncover deception. So, all right, this has not been very encouraging, has it? But I think there are some things that we as librarians and library workers can do. First of all, we should know that we are necessary, because perceived self-efficacy in detecting deception has really nothing to do with actual efficacy in detecting deception. Basically, if we are there to give people cues that deception can occur, that does help. I think this is about, there's some examples here based on phone interviews with where elderly people were called as part of a study and given some questionable information. And it really made a difference if someone had told them beforehand, hey, someone may call you up and give you some information that may be deceptive. I'm not sure quite what the scope of that was and how far apart that notification and the phone call was. But it does seem being able to at least tell people there's a possibility that there's inaccuracy out there can be useful. The reality check does matter. There was another promising model I found that could actually inform some of what we do, which is a gentleman named Bosch and who wrote a book on marketing, and which sometimes it sometimes does not involve deception, but sometimes it can too. And his way of thinking about the psychological processes involved. When you're looking at a sales situation, a customer has two mental processes. The first process is going to be effortless, focused on the short term and emphasizing a pleasant experience. You go in and you go into the car dealership and they start up a nice conversation with you, and maybe they get a hot dog or balloon for the kids or something, and everything seems to be going along well, and they're really willing to help out, and and so you just kind of go from high to high to high to high very quickly and without a lot of close analysis. The second process is slower and analytical, and it often occurs when there's an anticipation of risk. So it's not like, oh yeah, but how much money do I have? Can I afford this car? What are we going to do about our other expenses? How do we balance all of that out? We really need to think about what's going on here. So the idea behind marketing, which sometimes includes deception, is that people remain in the first category as much as possible. That's what the marketer wants, and keeps them out of that second category. So, and a lot of this is based on cognitive load, the idea of that. A skilled marketer or deceiver will give as much information as possible that keeps the person in the first category. Just kind of, fast talker. Just keep spouting out all this information, going very quick, being very superficial, but also to delay but not deny information leading to the second category. If that person says, oh, we can't get you that information, then suddenly, that the customer's immediately taken out of that first category. It's like, okay, I wanted to know something and I can't. And so what does the skilled marketer do? They say, I'll get to that later. We will talk about it. I'm going to, that some of that information's at the other office. I need to get it, or I'll have somebody else explain that to you. But we're going to keep talking in the meantime. So by the time the person actually gets that information that might be problematic, they've had this huge overload of information already, most of which is positive. And so then they have to decide how they're going to balance this out. The person has to decide whether they're going to, set aside all that positive interaction and deal with this problematic interaction. So this is my thought that I took away from this, which is, what about the web? We're talking here about a information delivery system that has a structure that leads to cognitive overload. There is always more information available. You could just, we talk in our classes about, you go to Google and you run a search and you get like your 1 million hits. You could go through all 1 million of those hits and you would probably, still have more information that you could seek out. So it is possible for someone who, in a marketing situation, would be led in that direction, led towards this positive interaction by someone else, to basically lead themselves effectively through this, where they're just getting a lot of information. It's very quick and it's very easy, and they can just their mental process kind of flips them to looking for information that confirms what they already think, and that is very sort of superficial. So they kind of get into that position themselves. And links are somewhat the links are a promise of that more information. That's like the whole the failure to stop, the failure to say, no, we're not going to stop you. We're going to say, we're going to defer that. So sometimes we say that finding a website with links is kind of an indicator, maybe an indicator that's more accurate if it goes back to the original source. But at the same time, it can also be a tool of deception, because people don't stop themselves. They say, okay, well, there's a link here, and maybe I don't click on it. Maybe I look at the other site, just very quickly, and it seems to say the same thing when actually it may be saying something else entirely. So it sort of continues to lead people down the garden path. I think that the web, unfortunately, though it is a great tool, is also in some senses a prime field for deception, because it allows people to do to themselves what a marketer would do to them when trying to sell them something. So that brings me to the CRAP test. And we all love the CRAP test, right? Well, there have been some, I think, recent modifications to this have been suggested, but I want to talk a little bit about this. And it has a lot of value to it. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it does not. Okay, some people do not like it, but there are some very good questions about it that it poses that I think are very useful to evaluating a source. However, I wanted to bring in a particular study. It's a little bit of an older study, but I think it's relevant to what we do. It's about deception in laptop sales. So the experiment was conducted on students in an MBA program. So we're talking about business savvy people, computer savvy people, people who have some experience with marketing techniques and all of that. And so what the experimenters did, they said, hey, we've got a website here. I want you to tell me if you think this would be a good site to purchase a laptop from for a friend. And even if you want to, you can even put in the credit card information if you feel good about it. And one of them was very clean, we'll call it. And the other one was had a number of questionable cues that was set up to basically set off the alarm bells. So what happened when they look at this? Okay, we found out that people are bad at detecting deception, which we already knew. So there was not any sort of indication that even these savvy individuals were doing a particularly good job of it. But The people who were able to successfully detect it used fewer cues. They looked at it, they looked at a few things and they said, okay, I'm not going to use this questionable site. As opposed to, and the people who had a harder time were using more cues. So my interpretation is that this lowered the amount of cognitive load on the person detecting by using fewer cues and gave them an easier time processing the information. So, but what about crap? Some of us really love crap. They are still great tools. I think there's a lot of usefulness in them, but we want to be able to teach students to bail on a piece if flags start appearing. If they could start to see that there's problematic aspects of a piece, they need to go and look at something else. They don't need to go through the whole checklist. In fact, that might be driving them toward information that's not bad, because they kind of say it's like, well, maybe 80% of the stuff on the crap test is good and 20% is bad. Well, really, they maybe need to be really worrying about that 20%. So that may affect kind of how we reach out to students about that, and how we teach them to use that particular tool. Another thing I would definitely say is to put emphasis on the relevance criteria. We want to get them somewhat out of that pattern by coming up with a question with their research questions up front, and really asking, does this piece deal with what I'm specifically with what I need to find information about? Because sometimes students think of this very broadly as, I need to find a website or an article about gun control, when really they need to find something that's a lot more limited. And if that's the case, then helping them to come up with that question as they go can help them to start to weed things out, so they're not looking at, maybe they're looking at 3 articles rather than 30, and then there's less of that cognitive load, and they can really focus in on what they need to be looking at. So what else? What are some other lessons I think we can take to the classroom? We can point out the deception can occur. We can just be upfront about that. Very short, sort of throwaway reference. It'll take, maybe takes 5 seconds to say, even in library databases, people can be trying to fool you. Maybe less than on the web, but that is always a potential. So that can kind of let people know, okay, this is what I'm getting into. One item that came up was that rewarding successful detection lowers accuracy. So if we're thinking about this in terms of classroom assignments, we may want to consider whether giving students a reward for, determining whether something is accurate or not is a great way to go about that. And we also could teach them some patterns so that people can switch from the first to second mental process. For example, calling out something obscene or similar phrase in the middle of reading. Just train people to do that, and just say, and just to break that internal pattern, and cause them to then say, okay, so now they're shifting from that first cognitive method to the second cognitive state. So they're starting to get more engaged and start to ask questions. Also to encourage them to take a break sometimes in the middle of reading something, and set it aside for a moment, do something else, which are probably, let's face it, our students are doing well enough at anyway most of the time, but bringing it to their attention can be good, and just say, come back to it and then see if you see anything different. So they're not, once again, staying in that first cognitive state all the time, where it's just like, okay, they're just kind of effortlessly going through and skimming it, and maybe, not paying that much attention. But then they come back to it and they have a different perspective. I think the final lesson that I have here is that there's better accuracy in group settings. It seems, I don't think I put a reference on this one, unfortunately. Sorry about that. But it does seem to be that it does reduce the cognitive load. Multiple people are sharing the cognitive load. There's a more tendency for someone there to be able to break the pattern. It's the same reason why, you may bring someone else with you when you're trying to buy a car, and so that person can, kind of stay back from the situation, and then give them and then give another perspective on it. And we can also do that with our students. So group activities are useful in terms of doing this, and may be something we want to consider, first of all, for our own programs. And when we design activities for students to go through a document, say, and figure out, whether there's something wrong with it or deceptive, but also something we may want to bring to the attention of our faculty colleagues. There should be I think it would be useful to have maybe more class activities where people are not necessarily just working on their own paper, maybe where they come into class, they bring in an article and that they're going to use, and they hand it to the other person and say, hey, what do you think? And I think there could be some value to that, and also helping them to know that the networks they're building of friends and experts as they go through college can actually be useful for them in making good life choices. All right, that's all I have. Thank you.
So,
I will. Yeah.
Dan, there's a lot of great discussion in the chat. And we've got a question in the Q&A, and I'll just remind our attendees that if you have any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A. From Dave, we have, this is fascinating, thanks, especially the research behind it. How would you say the framework authority is contextual, complicates, or facilitates the teaching of deception?
That is really tricky, and I don't know if my brain will process all of that right now. But I will say, one of the complicating things is that sometimes the authority can be whether there's deception going on or not. Maybe that's, the fact that this person, is that sometimes it's useful to know that the information you have is deceptive. I mean, the tricky part is, of course, because we rely on authority as contextual, does rely on the fact that on some extent that the authority is who they present themselves to be. So if there's an active case of deception, then you start having to go for that outside expertise in order to determine whether that authority can be relied upon. I don't know if I'm answering the question, but yeah, I think they're thinking about how authority is presented and what the markers of it are, and if someone can model those markers and how well they can do it, and how we teach students about that. I think that starts to get into sort of a higher level sort of examination of material that you wouldn't necessarily want to take, students taking their first library instruction class through, but it does complicate things.
Okay, and in the chat we have, how do you detect deception in databases?
How do you detect deception in databases? Okay, databases are actually a little bit better because we do insist that people put some sort of that there be at least an author added to it, so people don't have that particular option of just saying, just being very unclear about where the information is coming from, and making it clear what the source of it is. But I think I think it's still a tricky task, especially because for the most part, if you're using a lot of these databases, everything in it looks the same. So it's harder to read for any sort of marker to begin with that would even start us down that particular path. And the databases are also structured so that everything sort of is more or less on that result screen is going to look the same. So you get the people into that first mode of that first cognitive mode, and then they just kind of stay there. So I think that teaching people to take each piece that they look at individually, to go through it carefully, and then kind of put everything out in front of them and say, okay, so I got these 5 articles, and these 3 say this, and these 2 say this, and then try to figure out what exactly is going on there. So I think, but I think at the same time, it's hard. It's difficult. I mean, we have a few more cues there that we can kind of use to flag false information, but it's also, it's still based on the same principles of the web, and that tends to keep people in that first cognitive mode.
And then we have Naomi asking, did you come across any info about our institutions about deception and things like Turing tests? Does this just reinforce bad habits, or is there something that we innately have?
Let me see. I'm not quite sure what's being asked there. Oh yeah, well, I kind of know what.
Intuition, sorry. Okay. Intuitions, not institutions.
I do tend to tell students to follow their intuition, and even after following all this, I would do that on a limited basis, because I think the difficulty is you can pick up sometimes on the fact that there are markers there that you're not consciously thinking about, but at the same time, that often sort of brings itself into wishful thinking. So I do tend to, when I'm teaching, I do tend to put, to say, hey, if you feel something's wrong, that's a time to slow down and actually start looking at things a little bit more in depth. But I do very much want them to go back to those markers and start really thinking about what they're doing and questioning what they're reading after they get that initial sort of red flag.
Okay, we don't have any other open questions.
And I want to emphasize that this is very much me dipping into a bunch of different fields and trying to get something that I could bring back from it. I am not saying that I would actually encourage people who are interested in this topic more to go back to some of these items in the bibliography, which will actually be put up on the. I'll go ahead and start seeing if I can cycle through this. That'll be available in the recording and also be available in the PowerPoints. Because this is something where I think there are other fields that can offer us a whole lot, and we need to start maybe looking into them and seeing what we can bring back as a group to our library instruction.
Sorry, there is one more that got dismissed somehow.
Okay.
How do you differentiate between deception and misinformation or disinformation?
Oh gosh, misinformation. Well, okay, I wouldn't necessarily distinguish between deception and disinformation. I would distinguish from misinformation because, once again, it goes back to that question of intent. Misinformation, I can tell you something that I honestly believe and it's not correct, and that's misinformation. Whereas if I'm trying to actively deceive, it can be disinformation and deception. I should also say that this is also something that's useful. That sometimes it's important to understand that factual information can be disseminating factual information can be part of the effort that is also part of the deception. And in fact, it can actually make that case for deception stronger. If one of those acts is to tell you 5 different things that are true, and then you give the 6th one and that one's off, well then that's still deceptive, even though most of the information provided has been accurate. If the intent is to deceive by just highlighting certain facts and then putting a little twist on it or an interpretation on it.
Okay, now I don't see any more questions, but there is a ton of really great information in the chat. And this was a really fantastic presentation. So thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you, everybody.
So Dan, if you're interested, you had 101 at top level.
101 attendees.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you get 3, you could make it 104 if you want to boost it. But that's the panelists.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Oh,
I'm going to move you back down to attendee.
okay.
Well, did you run through all your bibliography yet?
I read through the whole thing, and I'm probably going to get offline here because I've got to finish up some other stuff today. But thank you for everyone who came. I appreciate the comments. I appreciate the attendance. Let me know if you have any questions.